People to come. There might be some people from an MA class who might come, but that's what we were waiting for. But anyway, thank you all for coming, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Tom Claes, who is an associate professor of ethics in Ghent University, which is in Belgium. Think about that. He is, since 2012, he's been the director of CEVI, the Centre for Ethics and Value Inquiry, which is responsible with CAPE for these series of talks. So, special thank you for helping us with that. He's also, together with Paul Reynolds, who you might have met 2 months ago if you came to his talk in December, the network leader and founding member of INSEP, the International Network for Sexual Ethics and Politics, and he's a member of the Ghent Centre for Global Studies, and co-promoter of the Ghent-based academic network for sexual and reproductive health and rights policy, bringing together activists and policymakers from more than 10 countries. He teaches and publishes on ethics, sexuality and globalization, and his main research focus is on issues of consent, the globalization of sexuality, sex work and trafficking. And I don't know actually what we're going to be talking about tonight, but I'm sure it's going to be great, so thank you.
Thank you for the compliment. First of all, bios like that are a bit scary and they tend to portray you in a bit more lifelike than you are. But thank you for the introduction, and thank you as well to Bob, people from CAPI, Ian, etc. for setting this series up. We are billed as one of the co-organizers, but CAPI is really doing all the work. So, title of my paper, and this time I have a paper, is called Sexual Rights and Sexual Politics. Me having a paper is quite a rare occasion. It's 20 pages long, and as Bob just told me, if you talk longer than 45 minutes, we'll kill you. So I went back to the hotel room and tried to skip parts that I don't need. I'm panicking in the process, of course. Okay, so without much further ado, first page I won't use. The questions I'm grappling with, because the title of my presentation is Sexual Rights, Sexual Politics, are the following. Is the recent sexual rights movement a good option for sexual emancipation? Forgive me for using this old word. And if not, why not? What is wrong with it? Can we do better? And if so, how? And can the sexual rights notion and movement play any substantial role in all this? I'm not sure what the correct answers are. I'm not even sure that what I'm going to tell this evening makes any sense, but we'll see where we get, of course. My hunch is that sexual rights and sexual-based activism indeed can make a positive difference, but also that we should not uncritically embrace human rights and sexual rights approaches as such. Not everything that has been done already is unmitigated positive, and that we therefore urgently need to rethink the ways we approach and frame these sexual rights and the activism initiatives based on them. We need to think through what we make those sexual rights to be, what their status and contents are, as well as critically evaluate the initiatives and projects that these sexual rights inform. In short, my position can be summed up as follows. Sexual rights as such are not the nec plus ultra in an emancipatory global and local sexual politics. There are definitely issues further beyond sexual rights, and sexual rights activism should be connected to these. But sexual rights and activism can, or so I believe, indeed be a meaningful part of a wider emancipatory sexual politics. Sexual rights and activism narrowly based on them, as such, cannot be the only things in an emancipatory sexual politics, but they can play a crucial role. Now, the next part was outline of the talk, but that will probably come out of it when I'm doing the talk. So let's start. So what are sexual rights? Well, To get this paper started, we only need to get the basic idea of what is commonly meant by sexual rights and what are its related concepts. In 2002, the WHO developed working definitions of sexual rights that since then have been widely quoted, and the WHO states, sexual rights embrace human rights that are already recognized in national law, international human rights documents and other consensus statements. They include the right of all persons, free of coercion, discrimination and violence, to, and then there's a list, the highest attainable standard of sexual health, including access to sexual and reproductive healthcare services, seek, receive and impart information related to sexuality, sexuality education, respect for bodily integrity, choose their partner, decide to be sexually active or not, consensual sexual relations, consensual marriage, decide whether or not and when to have children, and pursue a satisfying, safe and pleasurable sexual life. The WHO adds that the responsible exercise of human rights requires that all persons respect the rights, of course, of others. Sexual rights, then, as it turns out, are human rights. Human rights pertaining to the sexual life of people. Sexual rights stand also in close relationship to other notions like, for instance, sexual health, reproductive rights and health, although their exact relation remains a point of discussion. Recently, the wider concept of sexual rights has been integrated in another acronym, really, SRHR, Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights. And acronyms, of course, do a very good job of obscuring something, making its constituent words disappear from view somehow. By using, for instance, the acronym UN, you can escape from using the obvious faulty part United in it. So, whatever. The WHO links sexual rights explicitly to sexual health, and it defines this sexual health, and this is quite important, a state of physical, emotional, mental and social well-being in relation to sexuality, where this is taken to mean not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction of infirmity. Sexual health requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences, free of coercion, discrimination and violence. Sexual rights and sexual health are considered to be of crucial importance because, according to the WHO, sexuality, and I quote again, sometimes I just forget saying quote and unquote, but you can have the text if you want, so you can read it afterwards. Sexuality is a central aspect of being human throughout life and encompasses sex, gender, identities and roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, pleasure, intimacy and reproduction. Now, the WHO listing of sexual rights certainly is not the only one available. Since the notion of sexual rights made its appearance on the world stage at the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, the ICPD, in Cairo, the concept has been widely discussed and publicized. Sexual rights are one of the most recent additions to the arsenal of second-generation rights that have been formulated. Although there have been appearances prior to 1994, the concept has a relatively short lifespan in the sense that it's quite new. 2 decades, more or less. It is a relatively new concept. It's also a very hotly debated subject. Sexual rights certainly aren't universally accepted, whatever that might mean, by organizations and states. On the contrary, sexual rights, the notion of sexual rights and what they stand for, has many outspoken adversaries from within the UN system as well as from the outside. The question then becomes, if sexual rights are indeed human rights, although I'm not sure they have to be, what then to think of them and of sexual rights-based activism in light of some recent critiques that have been made against these human rights and the employment of human rights? Do these critiques paralyze and rightly undermine the concept of sexual rights and the sexual rights movement? And if so, is there some way of dealing with sexual rights that, at least up to a point, can somehow redeem them and make them useful again? That's the topic of the next section. The project of human rights, and if sexual rights are human rights, this is quite important, has come under severe attack from many sides recently, both from the left as well as from the right, and the criticism is based on many types of arguments and analysis. Human rights activists and organizations, according to some, turn out to be irritating know-it-alls and do-gooders. Well-intentioned or not, but naive or worse, and ineffectual or even worse, social and political activists and entrepreneurs. Different types of arguments and strategies can be distinguished. Some arguments are more pragmatic in nature, some more theoretical and radical. There are those, for instance, who argue that human rights and human rights machinery has been ineffective and even counterproductive, or perhaps even imperial, or counterproductive in making the world a better place. In short, that the whole human rights strategy and machinery has failed on its own terms. Then there are those who argue that human rights and human rights movement amount to a continuation of a Western colonializing and even imperial universalizing project. We learn that human rights and the liberal and even left state-based legal activism based on it assume and produce restrictive and individualist subjectivities and identity categories, that human rights constitute a form of neoliberal or liberal governmentality, that they exclude or foreclose different and alternative emancipatory politics, projects, etc., etc., etc. Before we look at... No, we're going to skip this one. I was just giving some moderate critiques from within the sexual rights and human rights movement about human rights. For instance, David Kennedy has written a book, The Dark Sides of Virtue, Reassessing International Humanitarianism, and he formulates a whole list of criticisms or worries, as he calls them, about human rights. Some 10 groupings, which are quite interesting. I'm not going to read through all the 10, but they're quite exhaustive and trenchant critiques. So there is, and that's the point I would like to make clear, there is even within the human rights movement and for the last 20, 15 years a heightened consciousness that there's something wrong with how human rights and how the human rights machinery is building and is working. So it's not so that only from the outside the anti-human rights movement criticism is being voiced. Also within the human rights movement we hear severe criticism of what's happening. Okay, see me slashing the paper. Kennedy draws up an impressive list, ranging from pragmatic worries about being counterproductive, by focusing on certain lawyers who stand apart from the people they are defending, making use of a state machinery and all these kinds of things. Being completely as a sort of complicit in a neoliberal Western Enlightenment way of thinking about subjects, etc., etc., etc. So all these critiques are being formulated within the human rights fold as well. But the point is, of course, when they formulate these human rights critiques, they formulate them as a sort of pragmatic critique, as a sort of, well, we can do better, there's something more to be done. These things up to a certain level at least can be avoided. So it's an impressive list, but bear in mind that Kennedy frames these worries as pragmatic worries. He considers them as worries that up to a certain level, as I said, can be remedied. As Kennedy writes, a checklist of possible downsides is not a general critique of human rights, of course. So that's the point. In this he is cited by many contemporary scholars and activists of the so-called field of praxis and scholarship that has been labeled critical international human rights studies. Frédéric Maigret, for instance, has recently inventorized the main critiques raised in these domains, and some, of course, run parallel to Kennedy's worries, others are worth highlighting. For instance, Maigret points to the neglect in the human rights movement to labor and labor rights, whereby human rights NGOs don't acknowledge these as belonging to their core mandate. The labor rights movement, so he writes, has been sidelined from the mainstream of international human rights, and he adds that it's not hard to see how such a separation is part of the complex management of a legal framework receptive to the operation of a capitalist economy. The movement's infatuation with agency, so he goes on, is also what frequently leads to discount the importance of structures because of its embeddedness in the liberal structure of rights, social democratic rights discourse, risks succumbing to the public-private dichotomy by focusing on state duties in ways that fail to challenge dominant private actors or the operations of the market, thereby rendering the movement vulnerable to the accusation that it's deeply complicit in the operation of the neoliberal economic policies. So these kind of criticism, you see where they're building up to. They're building all up to a more fundamental critique, linking human rights thinking, human rights activism, and the genesis, not in the 40s, but certainly in the 70s, of the human rights project, to the emergence of a neoliberal world order and a neoliberal state, neoliberal economy. Maigret also warns against something else. Against what he calls a moralizing strategy, a turn to ethics in thinking about human rights. There may be, so he writes, something too mild and polite about a mere ethics of rights, a way of rounding corners without challenging rights in determinacy. Maigret believes that a true politic of rights, and I quote, might emphasize the need to repoliticize rights by foregrounding debate and process over eternal truths, technocratic rationality, judicialization, difficult words, and universalism, for someone from Belgium. Okay, so it's not the case that within the wider HR field they remain unquestioned. But these criticisms are ameliorative in nature, albeit in the full or not so full realization that this will be difficult enterprise. In contrast to this ameliorism, as you could call it, some more fundamental critiques have been formulated. Radical critiques that takes on human rights and human rights strategies head on. And these critiques often seem, at least, to rule out the possibility of anything good coming out of HR and HR activism. And these critiques zoom in and go even deeper on the links between capitalism, human rights, capitalism, neoliberalism, and neo-colonialism, etc. Arguing that HR thinking and practices are complicit, internally and necessarily complicit to them. Not all these critiques come from the left. Hayek once wrote in The Mirage of Social Justice, I haven't read the book, but I found the quote somewhere. That the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1984, could be held accountable for precisely the rise in social justice based on, quote, the atrocious idea that political power ought to determine the material position of different individuals and groups. So there is a right-wing critique as well as a left-wing critique, but the left-wing critique, of course, is much more interesting. On the whole, this radical critique on human rights is left-oriented. And one of the most outspoken voices in this left-wing critiques on human rights is someone I've read quite a lot about preparing for this talk, which is Wendy Brown, of course. Her critique is particularly trenchant and has become a touchstone in the literature on HR and critiques. A well-known article, The Most We Can Hope For, Human Rights and the Politics of Fatalism, she concludes her review and radical critique of Ignatieff, his book Human Rights as Politics and Idolatry, as follows. It's an old ruse of liberal reformers to insist that all they're doing is a bit of good or holding back the dark. On this view, rights simply set people free to make the world as they see fit. They do not have normative or subject-producing dimensions. They do not carry cultural assumptions or aims. They do not prescribe or proscribe anything. They do not configure the political in a particular way or compete with other political possibilities or discourses. They simply expand autonomy and choice. It's Brown talking, suggested otherwise, and in deciding whether the reduction of suffering promised by human rights is the most we can hope for, I have argued that we must take account of that which rights discourse does not avow about itself. It's a politics, and it organizes political space, often with the aim of monopolizing it. It also stands as a critique of dissonant political projects, converges neatly with the requisites of liberal imperialism and global free trade. It's not the case that the whole of human rights discourse, she adds, does not avow this about itself, people like Kennedy do, etc. There are many critical voices. In her critique, we see echoes actually of the ameliorist critiques referred to earlier, but her critique is more radical, fundamental principle, and certainly less confident in the possibilities and opportunities of an HR approach to making the world better. In her analysis, one of the main reasons for this very negative appreciation is that she construes the neoliberal project as, in a sense, intimately, or perhaps even necessarily linked with the HR project. Global and concrete human suffering is not reducible to the impact of abusive state powers, so that when we counter these, all will be well, or at least better. If this were the case, then an HR approach might do some good, she concedes. But Brown diagnoses this suffering differently as a result of, quote, the relatively unchecked globalization of capital, post-colonial political deformation and superpower imperialism combining to disenfranchise people in many parts of the world. And she urges us to seek out more ambitious justice projects. Justice projects that, quote, seem remote if not utopian by comparison with the task of limiting abuses of individuals. She continues, is the prospect of a more substantive democratization of power so dim that the relief and reduction of human suffering is really all that progressives can hope for? She disagrees, of course, suggesting that, quote, there are still other historical possibilities and that fatalism is not merited. Human rights, to her, is not the most we can hope for. I agree with Brown, up to a certain point. HR activism, and hence also sexual rights as HR activism in the sexual domain, is certainly not the most we can hope for. If that would be the case, we would better get out the shovel, being in deep shit. Brown paints with an incisive but also broad brush, and her critique is wide-sweeping. Some have pointed out that Brown disavows or neglects the decisive role and impact, at least of some movements and activists, ignoring actual real-world sexual politics and struggles. There is some mileage in this critique. Not all is bad, and many have indeed worked for the best and did make the world better, even while using human rights as a tool for that. These initiatives are not only top-down, orchestrated by the United Nations and other kinds of organizations, but some are often grassroots-based, bottom-up, contextualized, and really attentive to local sensibilities and cultures. Another point of critique against Brown's analysis could be that she paints a too bleak a picture, and that she underestimates, well, it's the same sort of critique, underestimates the gains that have been had. But this is not what Brown is after, and she would probably, up to a certain point, agree with all this. Her critique is not pragmatic in nature, like Kennedy's, it's fundamental. It's a political, ideological, conceptual, theoretical critique. And the main culprit, of course, is neoliberalism and the disciplining technologies that are exploited within. The fact that HR and neoliberalism team HR and neoliberalism team well together is, of course, to many not a critique at all, but rather something to be welcomed, be it for pragmatic, enthusiastic, cynical, or other reasons. But count me out of that church. The neoliberal order, politics and project is, so I believe, indeed something to be very worried about. Although many of us in the West, the well-offs mainly, us, choose to ignore this and even revel in the new consumer possibilities the neoliberal spectacle and consumers world offers us. The neocolonial, imperial, neoliberal economy, politic and order has made the world, even the world, materially at least, indeed better for some. For many, in fact. But its impact and global reach and effects have made the world a worse place for probably many more. This uneven outcome is also the case when we turn to sexuality. We've seen the emergence and gradual acceptance of a whole, for some bewildering, array of sexualities and identities and practices. But this proliferation and acceptance, the word sexual citizenship comes to mind, also comes at a cost. Many of these changes have been law-driven, laws against discrimination, against gender-based violence, laws that protect the so-called vulnerable and victims, and in many cases, appeals were made to HR and sexual rights. It's not that these new laws and possibilities are bad in themselves, or need be, but we should realize that some of these breakthroughs indeed come at costs, or with costs. Disciplining identities, not challenging dominant heteronormativities, creating homonormativities, reinstating the family as a dominant and sacred type of union, the individualization of responsible risk managing as a way of life, the creation of what Bell called the citizen pervert, like the polyamorists, the BDSM community, and other non-normative or radically different identities. An all too simple equation, of course, of choice and autonomy with emancipation. And we can the list go on and on. This type of critique has been even furthered by people like Feng Xia, where she calls these second generation rights as biopolitical rights, as sort of disciplining political strategies, etc., etc. But I'll skip that one because it's in the line, of course, of the previous. We should always be aware, that's something we need to take from all these critiques, that the fact that using rights as a tool for justice has its downsides and paradoxes. A word that can often be encountered, paradox then, in writings on human rights. Brown has written about this in her Suffering Rights as Paradoxes, writing about rights strategies to counter violence against women, etc., etc. And she plays on these words. So sometimes it seems as if we should be doing without, but somehow we can't be doing without. And where do we try to play a balance or seek a balance? When we run over these critiques, HR and SR seem indeed deeply problematic, but HR need not be the only strategy, I think, and concepts to work with. We need to win through a different way of looking at and dealing with SR, sexual rights, and linking them, and we should link them to wider concerns of justice. That's what I hope to show in the next section, that this can be done, at least up to some point, but then you're limiting, of course, the value, in a sense, human rights-based value of sexual rights, because you try to take them on in a wider political project. You should dethrone them up to, in a certain sense. Then there was a whole section on whether it is true that sexual rights and human rights are necessarily linked to the neoliberal order. Prepared a whole 2 pages on Samuel Moyne's historical, etc., etc., etc. Drop this, try to get. Am I doing good, Bob? Okay. Can then human rights, or more precisely sexual rights, be a part of a more threatening enemy of oppression? And if so, how? Well, I think so. We need not to think of sexual rights not even as human rights, but we can think about them as, in a sense, protest rights, protest claims, way of struggling, voicing, cashing in on some of the value they have because they are rights and we all like rights and they somehow associated with human rights and we can be against human rights. This reminds me when George Clooney became engaged. One of the media was very quick to point out that his fiancée was a human rights lawyer. Somehow, probably reducing, in a sense, the terrible things she did. She can't be all that bad, snitching away the most eligible bachelor. Look, she's also a human rights lawyer. So it's not very bad. It was better when I... Okay, ignore that. Can you erase this? Okay. And the point is, of course, that sexual rights are quite young. And are being developed within this HR fold by all these big organizations, etc. But they're also very hotly discussed. What precisely are they? What's their status? Different groups come together in trying to formulate what they are. And one of the main things, of course, is that, well, the top brass level, states, etc., don't like the notion of sexual rights. They like the notion of reproductive rights. Much more. Why? Well, reducing women to reproduction, well, that's an interesting strategy. And they'll have kids. Or not, but, well, probably have. Because at one point, reproductive rights, it also is about abortion, contraception, but also safe uh, uh, having children in safe circumstances, etc., etc. It's also about the right to have kids. Let's not forget that. Some people want kids, but can't have kids, or only kids that they get because they were raped somehow, or etc., etc., etc. So it's a very complex situation. Marleen Temmerman from our university, who opened a few clinics in Africa and is head of the International Center for Reproductive Health, and she worked at the WHO for us, right? She was called Mama Daktari. When she went to Africa years, decades ago, one of the first critiques, of course, of some of the African women she worked with was, well, aren't you feeling unhappy because you don't have kids? So it's quite difficult, this. But sexual rights, of course, are quite complicated, in the sense that they're also quite positive. If you look at the development literature, they talk about sexual rights, but going beyond reproductive rights, linking it to a full concept of what it means to be sexually healthy, not in the sense of not ill, defect ovaries or whatever, but enjoying sexuality. Oh, and then people start really worrying. Enjoying sexuality, a right to sexuality, a right to pleasure. People like Andrea Cornwell, Susie Jolly, etc., have written all about these, of course. And that's very interesting. Because the sexual right to pleasure, well, then people really start worrying. Sexual right to pleasure? Okay, in the West. In some parts outside, gated communities perhaps. But was it to have pleasure in sex in Africa, in Latin America? When you're pregnant in El Salvador, you lose your child, 6, 7 months old, you can go to jail because there was an abortion. How can you have pleasure in sex? So the sexual rights movement is a bit of a problematic movement to many, because they say, well, when you talk about sexuality, it's about more than just being medically okay, it's also about recognition, it's also about pleasure, etc., etc., etc. So the sexual rights and the sexual rights movement is a bit off-center. They're not invited to the big groups. And I think there's a possibility, of course. They should not try to be invited that much, but stay, in a sense, confrontational, disrupting. And of course, the sexual rights movement is not a monolithic movement. You know, many different groups, etc., etc., localized groups. And there is, of course, something to be said about sexual health from a medicalized perspective. When you look at the statistics about childbirth and children dying by birth and mothers dying by birth, these things have to be redressed, of course. But there's something else to be said as well. Okay, so the sexual rights movement and the concept is in a sort of flux. It's under negotiation what we mean with that. And I think we should be using this. Not trying to be disciplined within the HR fold. And the sexual rights movement and idea has different backgrounds as well. It comes from medical issues, it comes from recognition issues, it comes from feminist perspectives, women's rights, etc., etc. Well, let's use this. In all this, therefore, there's an opportunity to be found. They're under construction. They retain some of their potential fighting spirit and character. There are still protest strategies to be fought by using sexual rights. And the agents, as I said, are very often mid or even low level, grassroots organizations, etc. But the point is, of course, the following. For sexual rights to have any meaningful impact at all, certainly in the global south, they need to become linked to issues of social justice. They need to become what Marge Berer and others have called repoliticized. This also means that the traditional standard top-down strategies for implementing them and working with them won't do. The mediating organizations in that case often are too distant from the people they work with or for. Often when the funding stops, for instance, and being dependent on external top-down funding always poses a threat, initiatives grind to a halt. Linking sexuality issues with wider social, economic and gender justice issues make sexual rights more relevant and direct. Sexuality is a fluid domain, and the presumption that there is a distinct, stable and identifiable domain of sexuality is obviously a mistake. what sexual rights are on the ground, in context, and how they figure in activism, in the end should be up to the people they are intended for, or that claim them. And if they don't claim them, there's nothing wrong with that. Of course. The sexual, reminding you all of a classic pro-feminist literature, sexual is essentially political. That's another point we can take with us. As Kate Millett correctly once forcefully argued, the sexual is essentially political. Sexuality cannot be defined completely. It's an inherently destabilizing and controversial site. No matter how much disciplining into docility goes into it. Sexuality has an enormous political potential and is the prime cultural and state and law-based disciplining site. Who owns sexuality owns politics. But it's also the other way around, of course. Well, it's written, or perhaps it's vice versa. Politics and issues of justice, therefore, cannot, forever and completely be or remain severed from sexuality. Claiming sexual rights, whatever they may turn out to be and however they might get filled in and translated to our concrete lives, is therefore always itself a political act. The real challenge is to keep things confrontational. Oh, still got 1 minute. But we started
We start very late, yeah.
Very late.
We start 10 minutes late.
Okay, so how would this look like? Using this unfinished notion of sexual rights, not codified in lists, but as a sort of action word. My favorite philosopher, Charles Leslie Stevenson, would call them persuasive definitions. Well, this push towards connecting sexual rights with wider issues of justice is actually widely felt and discussed within the SRHR movement that has been on the table from the start. And one of the things I've been exploring and looking at is, for instance, how these links between sexuality and justice in a wider context, linked to the actual needs and wider needs, not just medical conditions of people, have been developed. And are some interesting concepts to be had. For instance, the notion of reproductive justice. Okay, it's still about reproduction, but the notion of reproductive justice is something I think we can work with. By the way, Brighton is a hotbed of sexual rights activism and writing. University of Sussex, Unitan, Pig, etc., etc. Is Unitan from University of Sussex? I think she. Yeah. Well, the notion of reproductive justice was initially developed by U.S. women of color organizations like Sister Song, Women of Color Reproductive Health Collective, the Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice, etc., etc. And with the notion of reproductive justice, they tried to do something more than just reproductive rights, to claim reproductive rights. But of course, you can have a baby and you can have the pill, but what are you going to do with that when you're being forced not to take the pill, or when you have a baby, don't have the money to raise the baby properly, send it to schools, etc., etc., when you're pushed into having yes or no a baby. So it's not about choice, because somewhere I've read the issue of choice mainly is an issue for people who already have choice. It's about not giving people the choice. It's about much more than that. So, this reproductive justice notion is interesting. And there are three tier activities within this kind of approach. There's of course reproductive health, because you need it, or sexual health. It's something you can't do away with it. Focusing on reproductive service delivery, etc. There are reproductive rights that come into play, and these focus on legal and policy advocacy and reproductive justice. And the reproductive rights lens is of course legal based, but it's firmly linked to what, and I quote, the final reproductive justice component that works to organize individuals and communities to create structural change, challenge power inequalities. It emphasizes the way states and commercial control and exploitation of women's bodies, sexuality, and reproduction are often strategies for controlling communities of color, etc., etc. I think that using this kind of inspiration can be of use for this emerging sexual rights movement, and that they shouldn't be looking too much to the UN and all these things. So yes, I believe that, this is my last paragraph, sexual rights can be an inspiration and a model for using. But we need to keep the lessons in mind, and we need to take on the criticism and the rightful criticism made by people like Brown, of course. Not only do we need to move beyond the focus of reproduction and widen our scope to the broader domain of sexuality, keeping in mind that sexuality can have many different meanings to many different people and peoples. We may not essentialize a commodified type of Western sexuality and use this as a touchstone as our activism. We must also realize the limits and possible disciplining effects of rights thought and of making a working coalition with the law and the state. We must take on board and listen to those who may or may not benefit from sexual rights and activism, even if this sometimes could mean not interfering or not using a rights-based approach. The importance of voices from below is therefore all the more important in the project of anchoring sexual rights in a wider justice framework, in which a struggle against oppression and inequality, against meaningful expression and solidarity play a crucial role. We also need to be very attentive to the danger, contradictions and paradoxes of using sexual rights. The work of justice transcends the legal domain. In effect, often precisely challenges this very legal domain and their gatekeepers and prime guardians like states. Because of all this, critiques, like the critique of Brown, how radical they may be, do have their value and may not be ignored. Sexual politics in which sexual rights can have a meaning of place and role also can never be a top-down or even avant-garde politics. But that doesn't mean that we can't do anything or can't do nothing. Solidarity is key, but this should not mean an excuse for messing up people's lives. In a brutal world that keeps on moving, we should be doing something that just might make the world a better place. At least a bit better than, quoting Jeffrey Warnock from The Object of Morality, when none such things were done. That's it.
Okay, folks, there's some time for some questions. Can I have some of mine? Is that right? Okay. Okay, Jasmine.
Hi. With regards to where an interaction between two people with sexual rights causes an issue, so referring to Amnesty International's idea about it's a man's right to have sex if he would struggle to find it because of some social nervous disposition, and therefore you should never demonise a buyer or a someone who engages in sex worker. And I think there's, I don't know, it's an interesting issue. What do you think about that?
About Amnesty's position about decriminalising prostitution?
Yeah, but not specifically that, but they say that you should never demonise the buyer because it's his right to have sex because he may not be able to get sex for other reasons such as a social disposition that causes him not to be able to. And so for that reason you should never demonise them.
I don't think that's the position of Amnesty.
That's they well, it might have changed recently, but there's quite big recently. I may have misunderstood.
Well, whether it's Amnesty's position or not. Well, Amnesty indeed calls for a decriminalisation of prostitution for a lot of reasons, of course.
Yes, yeah.
And one of the reasons is a pragmatic one. According to Amnesty International, and they did some research, and it's one of the most explosive debates in society these days. Well, their point is, of course, or their conclusion is that, for instance, criminalizing the market and certainly also criminalizing the client delivers what it is supposed to do, namely eradicating prostitution. Well, this of course is the case, but it doesn't make prostitution go away. But what we see, and there's quite a lot of social research about that in places where there's heavy criminalization, also criminalization of the client, prostitution goes underground, and that the net effect, of course, is of all this that you hand over the field of prostitution, sex work, in the hands of criminals even more than is now the case. So these are kinds of arguments that Amnesty works with. They also think, of course, that it's up to the women to decide to a certain point what they're doing. Amnesty doesn't condone forced prostitution, because forced prostitution is exploitation. That's the difference. But they leave open the possibility that in some cases people can sell sex without being forced. So that's quite a complex position and a sort of defense position towards let's not make things worse, and what works best is a decriminalizing activity which does not equal prostitution hooray. What I think about it. Well, I've been working with people last year or so in farmers about these issues. Talking to sex workers, to prostitutes, male as well as female, transgender, etc., bar owners, and also anti-prostitution lobbyists, etc., etc. I know what it feels being silenced. Because whenever you're a bit critical about some arguments formulated against prostitution, you're vehemently attacked. Happened to me. My option would be decriminalization as well, which is not the same as saying morally this is something you should do, or it should be possible. Kant, as well as Björn Zimmel and others, say, well, prostitution is in a sense moralische Verderbnis in German. Well, it's a moral horrendous thing. But bear in mind, Zimmel adds, this is as well the case for the buyer as for the seller. So there are some things to be told. It's a very dubious practice. That's morally suspect. So I don't join the liberal choice chorus. And I know some of my colleagues say, well, they choose for it. Let's go for them, and I'll write the statutes for their escort firms, etc., etc. So when I'm invited doing these classes in those liberal criminologists classes, I always take with me a bunch of feminist literature that I don't necessarily agree with completely, but they should have an answer. This is not really an answer. The longer I look at it, the more problematical prostitution is. But that's no argument for criminalizing. Basically.
I've got Bob.
Yeah, I want to take you back to near the beginning. What's wrong with Hayek's objection to rights? Taking rights out of politics. It seems quite a good idea, isn't it? If we're serious about rights, they shouldn't be left to political exigency. So political action, if rights depend on particular political groups to assert them, then rights are useless, isn't he right? As shown by what you said towards the end about justice rather than rights.
When rights are linked to political groups or interest groups, what's wrong with that?
Because then what happens to particular groups of people depends on the political situation in which they find themselves, which isn't good enough for human rights. If human rights are serious, they should transcend any political arrangement.
Yeah, is this a reason to completely lose the rights for capitalism?
No, that's a different question. I'm just wondering why you think Hayek's critique is simply so much poorer than, say, the left critique of rights. Seems to me spot on.
Well, I wasn't thinking that it was less or whatever. to be honest, I just put it into.
Okay.
But the point is, of course, just to remind you that different people, for different reasons, can have problems with human rights, or with rights-based activism.
No, but I mean, my only point is that I sometimes worry that on the left, I'm making some assumptions here, we tend to reject arguments which come from the neoliberal right because of their origin rather than their content.
Yeah, absolutely true. Same thing that's happened in prostitution
Well,
discussions,
that's
etc.
yeah.
Bonnie.
Hey, like the shifts from reproductive rights to sexual rights, do you think that symbolises kind of like dog whistle politics, kind of resentment? You know, in the heydays of social liberalism, second wave feminism was born. However, the kind of conservatives said that that muted their freedom and their kind of equality overruled their liberty. So this kind of new sexual rights discourse around choice, do you not just see it kind of that the liberal side of equality and freedom, the liberty side, has like won?
Well, if that would be the case, yes. But the point I was trying to make was that this is not necessarily or a mainstream. When you look at people working in WHO, in the UN system, etc., I think what you're saying is up to a certain level true. When you uncritically think about sexual rights, it's about choice, it's about individuality. But the point I was trying to make is that when you solely look at them that way, they'll lose quite a lot of their bite. And I just hope that it's not too late, because if they become solidified in these texts, medicalized, choicealized, but you know what I mean, then the sexual rights movement would have failed. So I grant your remark. There is a pull towards that. But people, of course, realize, people on the ground, and what I'm interested in, and that was in the first part, not in high theory or whatever. When I teach my course on sexuality and globalization, and what interests me is people trying to make their work and their lives a bit better. For instance, female genital cutting or mutilation. I once was in I organized a lecture series on sexuality globalization and invited this Molly Cameron figure I was talking about. And she does quite a lot of work on FGM. And she was talking about how in her practice in Kenya, etc., what their strategy was not standing there like, you may not do this. Because that doesn't work. Not saying to these women, you have the choice not to have your baby, etc., etc., etc. Of course, they have the choice. Broken the choice. What they try to do is speak to the village elders, speak to the women, speak to the men, saying, well, we know it's quite a lot of times it's the mothers who push for FGM. So what are you going to do? These are some of the paradoxes. You may not do it. You are a bad woman. Renee is that now. Alualo. Anybody knows Alualo? This is the wrong way to go. When you're standing there and frame something in terms of choice and morality, you lose, in a sense, local groups. And that's what you see in Africa, that's what you see in Latin America, in the Arab world, for instance, about not wearing a veil or a scarf or whatever. Lebanon, we have a paper just about Lebanon, the LGBT community in Lebanon is quite an interesting one. They don't want to model themselves to Western glittering, well, go to the canals in Amsterdam on World Gay Day or something that's called. This is not our model. So it's not simply about, I want to choose and do these things. On the floor, on the ground, you do things differently. And that's what I was trying to say. So yes, you're right, but I think that there's opening for doing things differently. The question then, of course, would be, do you need rights for that?
Martin.
I think they can be useful.
I'm sorry if it's going to sound silly to start with, but just okay. So, to me, it seems like when we talk about human rights, it's pretty much parallel to thinking about, for example, like a Labour government under Corbyn in the UK, in the sense that it's still completely it's still completely within the traditional power and state apparatuses and economic functions of the state, but we're better off with it than we would be in comparison with the Tory government, for example. So it makes sense to have rights, they'll still do atrocious things, but at least they do something. But to me, it doesn't make sense to think of the pursuit of a sexually ethical society in terms of human rights. To me, that's nonsensical.
Well, in a sense, that was also part of what I was trying to say. Trying to look not at sexual rights as sort of applied human rights, but using sexual rights, it could be a completely devastating endeavor or idiotic endeavor. When linked to wider discussions and political notions, that they somehow can have some power, some clout. And the reason why I'm thinking about this way is precisely what I said to the colleague over here. I'm interested in what happens in these small villages in Africa, in Asia, etc. And then you have a different way of thinking about these things than a Corbyn government, etc., etc., etc. And then I see in quite a lot of reports and articles and manuals and training strategies and etc. Some people, not all, do indeed do something positively with these human rights. When they're bottom up, it gives them a language, a discourse. Discourse. Am I allowed to use the word? So yes, I don't disagree with you, but I don't think the notion of sexual rights has that much to mean, in a sense, anymore in the rich West. I think it's more interesting how it plays out in the global South. But I don't have the answer.
Sorry, this is quite a vague section of a question. But so you said you gave a quote from Wendy Browning, which she says that that we should argue for a new conceptualization of rights because the one that we have under the current human rights doctrine is not the best that we could possibly hope for. Is that roughly what she said?
I'm not sure whether she wants to have a new conception of rights.
Oh no, but sort of like a new way of arguing for liberation without necessarily...
Well, she wants to explore, having us exploring different ways of liberation and emancipation and political struggle.
Okay. And your final point was sort of, it seems to say that it's better to have what we have than to... It's better to live in a world in which we have these human rights because of the gains that they've got us. And the point that you were making about them being sort of essentially quite good practice, they're a good way of explaining things to people. I just wanted to know how exactly you would formulate sexual rights in such a way as they were distinct from human rights, so that they could have all of the rhetorical benefits without the neoliberal baggage.
Very good question. I'm not sure whether I have a correct answer or an answer to that. We passed the exam. Do we have no? It's something I'm struggling with, yeah. But I don't... Well, the rights thought, of course, when sexual rights were formulated, the core idea and the concept was formulated, was within the concept of human. And we tried to make a wedge between the two. But not all rights are human rights. You don't have to have the full weight of charisma of human rights behind sexual rights. There are some interesting studies, for instance, I can send you some of the references, where local groups of women trying to set up a local clinic or to do something about it, HIV infections and safer small things, and they encountered, in a sense, oppression or resistance from some male groups, etc., etc. What you can do, of course, is go over there and say, well, patriarchy and all these things, but let's look at fine-grained mechanisms. There are some reports, and some interesting reports, about where women, men as well, use the language of rights to make a change. Does this mean that they would have the state drawing up a law that in this community this is not allowed? That's not the way they use these rights. So, I have a right to my body. Well, they don't link this to the human right of privacy or whatever. So this is immediately what, don't touch me. And this is a very minimal sense of what rights are about. The protest claims. But perhaps this notion is theoretically useless, but pragmatically it is being used. Well, I don't really have an answer to it.
I've got Robin.
Yeah, I'm sensing that part of your worry is that if the sexual rights movement go through the UN, the rights that they offer will be translated beyond comprehension, they'll have their radical potential neutralised, and as a result they'll perhaps be less useful as protest rights. They'll fix the meaning in a way that hampers those struggles. I suppose what I want to ask is whether you think that actually, even if they were translated in that way, could it not be the case that they might still be used by those grassroots actors in the ground in the global south?
Absolutely.
And as they are used in different ways, given different meanings.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And might that mean that, in a sense, you can have your cake and eat it, and you can say that they can be something more radical, and we can still play strategically and go and have that, but always acknowledging that that's never enough.
Yeah, sure. That's what I was trying to say. We should take these criticisms on board. But what are you going to do to the selective of women somewhere in Congo? Don't use the words rights. Well, and there's another problem. Probably this question will be popping up later. Sexual rights? What makes these rights sexual? Of course. And that's another. Get me started and we can go all about it years and years probably. Stacey Lee Pick and Vincent Adams put together a very interesting book about morality and development, I think it's called, where she looks at how medical programs, often rights-based, etc., are being used in non-Western communities to train and to make people medically better. And this ends up, of course, in very strange situations, informing nurses or people who work with bodies. Now look at the woman's body. They're all in class there. It's a beautiful article. Look. And then they map out the body. These are the sexual parts. And you have to learn what the sexual parts are, because now you will be working in a Western medicalized system of using etc., etc., etc. That's hilarious. But it's also, in a sense, up to a certain level needed. But you see the same kind of formative ways of creating identities and even bodies, so to speak, from all sides. It's not only rights talk that does it, it's medical things that does it. Probably some types of politics will do the same things. So this is something I'm wondering about, referring, well, we need something else than rights, we need to have something more radical and different emancipatory projects. Wouldn't they be disciplining also, in a certain sense? Perhaps better disciplining system. Do not forget that some people want to choose to be a newly designed identity. The global game. Getting online. Buying things. Looking at game shows, etc. In China, as well as in Japan, as etc., etc. So So not everybody feels this awkwardness of this disciplining thing. Some see them as possibility, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Again, yes.
So a lot of what you were saying seemed to me a kind of a decentralization of sexual rights as being kind of connected to specific bodies. Is that correct?
In a sense, yeah.
Okay. And so what that makes me think about how that lets ground root movements or movements in general, organizations, to kind of select the sexual rights that they choose to pursue, right? And I can see both the benefits of that and the costs of that. And I wonder if you could talk about that. Is there like, are you losing something when you like get rid of that WTO list or WHO
You don't
list?
have to get rid of it completely. If it helps you,
When you
your point made through some people or use it, whatever. Well, who has the power to speak, so to speak? Many reports, for instance, that illustrate the point you're trying to make. I was reading an article on, for instance, women with HIV, AIDS, etc., trying to organize their lives and make at least their world a bit better, sorry to speak in these terms. And then, of course, the do-gooders come over. And some of those do-gooders are really good people. That's true. And there was funding for the initiative, and there was 2 years or 3 years going on, and things got better, and then the funding stopped. I referred to it in the paper. And those people were trying to make a difference to the other people. Look at us. We are here and we work with you. Not to help you, we're working with you. All went well. Well, the problem, of course, is that, in a sense, one of the things that needed to be done was to convince the women that they had to fight the struggle. When you look at these fine-grained stuff, things become to change. So these women wanted to have more choice or be medically well or whatever, somehow lead a better life. And then these people say, well, in order to have this, you have to have a wider agenda than just a medical one. You have to fight for your rights. To be politicized, thereby antagonizing all the men in the community. So it's never as clear cut as and who selects what. Even saying to people that formulating their problems in terms of rights, not only select them, well, that's already something you do. That's why I said you don't always need to use sexual rights to try to make the world as someone's world better. So what I'm trying to do is a very minimalist agenda. Just stay away from all the top level, up to a certain level, to a certain point. Repoliticize, in the sense that integrate them in wider discussions. Try to situate a voice with the people who are not speaking, who are speaking but not listened to, or not understood. Does this change the world overnight? Of course not. Is this positive in all occasions? Of course not. Probably. But if sexual rights, to me, have any future over and beyond disciplining effects, etc., you were referring to it, and you were as well. Well, this could be a way to go. Whether it's a possible way.
And Mark?
Tom.
Hi.
Hello, how are you? I wanted to ask a question which is about rights again, but then link it to the question of sexuality. It strikes me that you are, without explicitly saying it, playing with the way in which Rancière talks about rights. And when he develops a critique, so this is just I'll explain. He develops a critique of Hannah Arendt, and Hannah Arendt basically says rights are redundant. And they're redundant because you either already have them, because you're a citizen, you have rights, or if you're not a citizen, your rights are void because you can't activate them. And he says, well, actually, she's wrong. Rights are precisely both what you have and don't have. If you have them, they're redundant, but if you have them and you don't have them, then you activate them to lay claim to them. So rights, in a sense, are quite odd, because they're never something you really have or don't have. They're only politically, they're only activated when they are politically efficacious. And it's in being laid claim to what you don't have and saying, well, I do have them, but you're not letting me have them. And that then potentially is interesting in relation to sexual rights. Because if rights are made sort of almost empty in that sense, you can begin to extend the right, for example, to sexual pleasure, or the right to other forms, in an endless chain that goes on and on and on. So I just wondered, I didn't know if you'd read Rancière's essay on rights. But
it's time to make a confession.
Yeah.
A few years ago, you were in Ghent.
Yeah, I was, yes.
Yeah. We did a workshop. Ian was there as well.
And I enjoyed the gin, it was great.
And Ian presented our Rancière.
I did.
Yeah. And I sat there. So, well, actually, probably this guy has some interesting things to say. And who is Rancière? Never even heard of him. And doing solid research for what I'm trying to do now, the first page was, I'm not very high on theory. And then you go into all these, and then Rancière was on my reading list. I even bought the book Wronging Rights, where one of his articles is left to read it. I must say, I've skimmed through the article. I found it quite tough reading also. But apparently, it's something I could find some inspiration in. But I haven't read him. But I can do, perhaps, if you can have the
Slide.
Yes, I can use my slide. Perhaps this is some of the thing you're referring to, because it's also something that informs what I was trying to do just now. But I can't draw on the board.
It's either just booting up
Apparently
or
it's
I
not
don't
a
know
board.
how to promote it. I mean, I press PC. Can I ask you a really simple question while we're waiting for the slide? You can ignore the question if the slide works. It sounds like, and it's really simple, but it sounds like you're advocating pragmatism. And if so, because there's a certain universalism versus particularism, and I know it's kind of Global Ethics 101 to think about that in relation to human rights and sexual rights. But you're kind of saying, look at the details, look at the fine textured situation and circumstances. I mean, that sounds like pragmatism to me. Take case by case basis. And if it is pragmatism, then what criteria do you use?
Well, I think case by case is particularism. Not
Fine,
necessarily
particularism.
pragmatism.
Okay, particularism. Even if it's particularism, what's the criteria you use to decide each time you have a decision to make?
I don't know.
I'm sorry. Yeah?
Carry on.
Oh. Well, can I introduce it? It's using a model that's been developed by George Witzer, a sociologist, for looking at processes of globalization, and he uses it for hamburgers and things like that. And he makes a distinction between two processes going in different directions, and are similar ways of thinking about these things, like hybridization and etc., etc. But he uses the terms globalization and globalization. And globalization, that's growth. And some social forms, as he calls them, and they're social forms, even when they're a Whopper or hamburger or Coca-Cola, they're social forms, are globalized. Social forms that are globalized.
There we go.
Oh, yeah. Very often are, well, that's to say, the globalization of something comes from very often a firm or an organization that wants to become worldwide, so to speak. We want to sell our hamburgers, we want to do this, we want to do that, etc. There's an enormous growth potential and dynamic within globalizing firms, organizations, etc. United Nations is a globalizing phenomenon. Liberalism is, etc., etc. Ethics is a globalizing issue. And then he makes another process which is the global or globalization. Some things can become localized or anchored in the local, being from somewhere else, but then significantly, one way or another, integrated. It's not completely assimilated, but they can play a role within the own world and life. And he makes a distinction between some things and nothings. Nothings are empty social forms, and he gets the idea from Simmel, which I very much like, of course. Nothings are, and there's a definition for that, very often centrally conceived, minimalistic in what they stand for, that they are, in a sense, chameleons. And you can have Coca-Cola everywhere, but what Coca-Cola is to many, you can have different ways of promoting Coca-Cola, etc. Now nothings can easily be globalized, or it's easier to globalize nothings. They're good bedfellows. Coca-Cola, Whoppers, Benetton, sweaters, Gucci bag. Some things have more content. Well, he refers to whatever, Indian food, for instance. Of course, Indian food we're eating in London, which is, by the way, much better than in Ghent, but still that's Indian food. But in a sense, there are some things that can become globalized as well. And localized. We have Indian restaurants in art can be something as well. Now, this is an interesting thing, because he uses it for these things. When you make this into a dynamic model, this has been the background of what I was talking about. When we look at the following. Nothings are things like human rights discourse, or drop that, women's rights, global citizenship, cosmopolitanism, global justice, the global game, sexual rights, etc. But with these brackets, what they precisely are, well, they need to be filled in, they need to become some things. So there is dynamic, all this talk about sexual rights, well, that's very handy and interesting, but what do you mean with it? And then they're turned into, some things in a sense, more something. Reproductive rights, sexual health, the definition of the WHO, etc., etc., etc. People try to work with these notions. Women's rights, well, precisely are women's rights. What do they amount to, etc., etc. This is interesting, because this is very often the work of intellectuals and high-level organizations, etc. It's seeding seeds. It's saying, well, this is a language you can use, this is a concept, etc. Buzzwords, so to speak. Here is interesting, they become filled in. But it's not the end of the story, of course. People do all kinds of things with these words and with what they stand for. Now, the normal way of reading this is the way talking about sexual rights is often, and human rights as well, is, well, there were some very intellectual people after the war, and they said, well, we need to do this, and they looked at their Enlightenment books, etc., etc. We have human rights. Puff, this is our list. Many of them aren't rights, but just observations, I think. And then they made a list. And then it's, now you have to employ these rights within your local community as well, be it states or grassroots, etc. Of course this is the case. And you even have something else. These top-level organizations create organizations to watch over this globalization process. So you have funded groups of people who like to go to a very nice place of the world and then be there for a few years or 1 year and supervise the implementation of sexual rights in this Dominican Republic, whatever. Or they go to a very nice place where it's food, sea, holidays, etc., etc. These are void empties that being localized. These are not very often not the interesting parts of the process. When you read it differently from that side, there's also another way of thinking about it. Yeah, some of these notions are being transferred. Some of these notions are being used. And they have an impact as well on the discussions and political issues that are being fought out here. And I'm more interested in this than in this. And it's very often overlooked because perhaps, well, this is disciplining, this is biopolitics, this is biopower, this is etc. Yes, this is true. But also something else. It may be futile and meager, but it's too often overlooked. That, in a sense, that was what I was hearing when you were referring to Rancière. So you can come at it from different sides. And Ritzer is a bit easier to read than Rancière.
Okay. Any last final question? It might be 8 o'clock. Okay, so let's say thank you. That's great. Thank you, Tom.